My name is Carly Sherman, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Notre Dame. My master's thesis and now my dissertation work engage the contemporary pagan and witchcraft community in the United States. Even if you're not sure what all that entails or what pagans or witches do or believe, chances are you've seen some of the trappings. Tarot, astrology, energy healing, meditation, crystals, and herbal magic have been having a moment. And while these things were once fairly esoteric and niche, they're now in the mainstream. Interestingly, the word occult literally means hidden or secret. So the fact that these practices have become trendy is something of a transformation of the field. As Kevin Whitener Jr. puts it, a hungry public is happy to finally see their unique interests no longer derided but seemingly embraced. The embrace that is transpiring, though, is certainly not neutral and arguably more akin to subsumption. So the question is, what happens when counterculture becomes capitalist consumer culture? While all witches have to contend with this landscape, witches do not all agree on whether the impact of this mainstreaming is good or bad for the community. Witchcraft has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's incredibly easy to get your hands on things like tarot cards or runes or spellbooks or primers on intro Wicca. There's a lot of money in this business. Corporations are cashing in on this trend and selling magical tools and witchy aesthetics. It's in the media, especially all over social media, and also in entertainment media, in pop culture. The fact that so many culture, entertainment, and style blogs feel moved to comment on this trending spiritual identity indicates that something about witchcraft and the people who practice it are relevant to the current zeitgeist. Which begs the question, how did we get here? 1996 was a watershed year for witchcraft in the media. Kicking off the movie The Craft started a wave of media depicting witchcraft based on real and identifiable neo-pagan practices rather than as something that was fantasy or horror. So not only are more people becoming at least passingly familiar with witchcraft as a phenomenon, it became a gateway for many people to become aware of and interested in witchcraft for the first time, leading to a huge influx of new people into this community. Prior to 96, it could be argued that the neo-pagan movement consisted mostly of people who had connections to the eco-feminist and goddess movement of the 60s and 70s, or were part of initiatory and lineaged witchcraft traditions like Wicca, who were embedded in this fairly close-knit network where everybody kind of knew everybody. Everyone was reading the same books, subscribed to the same community zines. But the rise of high-profile witchy media inspired a new generation of people drawn in by trending pop culture, who had no part in the so-called shared mental universe of traditional witches that were already in the community at that time. And for the most part, these newcomers had no access to teachers, training, or initiation within lineaged witchcraft traditions. So there was an initial feeling of separation from what had been the core of witchcraft prior to the media boom and afterwards, in which you have a flock of people, usually young people, coming into the witchcraft community who may be suspected of following a fad or adopting the identity somewhat superficially. Media facilitates identification with what Benedict Anderson calls imagined communities, made up of indirect and hypothetical bonds to a community that one considers themselves a part of, even if you don't know anyone personally who shares that identity. This is a key way by which isolated individuals can feel connected to a larger subculture of people who are like them. This is also going down right at the dawn of the internet era, which of course was another huge transformation of the way people could meet and communicate with like-minded others. A lot of this media also appealed to the so-called edgy, rebellious teenage demographic, but there's actually something to that sociologically. So Marilyn Brewer talks about this idea of optimal distinctiveness. Georg Simmel talked about the competing impulse to want to feel a sense of belonging to a group, while also wanting to stand out as a unique individual. So there's real appeal in subcultural and countercultural groups as a way to stand out as different from the mainstream society, especially if you're someone who might feel marginalized by it, while also having the benefit of feeling of connection with a group of like-minded people. And so what you have here is attraction to a subculture that is primed for appropriation. So I asked myself, how does the trendiness of witchcraft in pop culture and media affect feelings of solidarity or groupness within the witchcraft community? How do people navigate these symbolic boundaries in order to communicate their group membership to other members in the in-group, as well as people outside the group? And what do these processes look like, and what criteria do witches draw on to do this? Finally, how does the accessibility and visibility of trendy identities shape the performance and perception of authenticity within identity-based communities? My recruitment was mainly through digital flyers that I shared in online groups targeted to pagans and witches on various social media, and then also using some snowball sampling by asking my participants to recommend others. Ultimately, I interviewed 23 participants for this project, the majority of whom would be considered millennials or Gen X, although there were a few participants who were in their 60s. My sample was overwhelmingly white and skewed towards women, but that is fairly typical of this community in the United States. I'm only going to focus on a few of my findings here due to time constraints, but a big one I found is that witches fall into one of two camps, either mainstreamers or mystery seekers. One illustration of this is how people are using labels, or W and P words, so whether they're embracing or shying away from the loaded words witch and pagan that may seem off-putting to a general public. And then two things that really came up again and again were ease of access to materials and information, as well as the heightened visibility of witchcraft as something to contend with and as an aesthetic trend. So the two camps can be summarized in this way. On the one hand, it's great that witchcraft is more mainstream now than it used to be. I want my practice to be seen as just as legitimate as other major world religions or lifestyle practices. The more exposure people have to witchy stuff, the better, because if it's familiar, it won't seem so scary or silly or unusual. And above all, I just want witchcraft to be accepted as normal. On the other hand, the concept that witchcraft is fundamentally wild and other. Its power is in being countercultural, subversive, and standing outside of mainstream society. There's power in keeping silent and preserving the mystery, and the easy access to commodified goods and questionable information on the internet is not doing us any favors. I don't like that witchcraft has become a trend, and I don't want to be seen as normal. When pressed to choose one or the other, my sample broke down in this way. However, it was clear in interviews that many of my participants were conflicted on this issue and would sometimes express the logics of one camp and at other times express the logics of the other. So these positions should be understood as ideal types, points on a spectrum rather than as a clear-cut dichotomy. I still find it useful to tease out these two opposing standpoints, however, because it does shed light on the process by which people navigate these contradictory value sets. So we can ask, for example, under what circumstances do witches demonstrate the logics of each condition? What's the draw of each camp? What problems do each of these positions help witches to solve, etc.? Wiccan author Ivana Burrow talks a little bit about what the stakes are for witches in preserving the mystery when it comes to particular initiatory witchcraft traditions that are what is referred to as oath-bound, bound to secrecy about aspects of the tradition, and this has important theoretical implications. So Burrow notes that the reasons that oaths and secrecy are important is threefold: to protect the craft from arseholes, fraudsters, and abusers, and other nasty types, to hedge the true mysteries, that which cannot be spoken, around with secrets, that which must not be spoken, to protect the unprepared from accessing experiences that they are not ready for. Being a witch is cool. People want in without doing the work or preparing themselves properly or learning in advance. The purpose of the oath is to protect the wanna blessed bee types who don't want to put in any work from real magic, and the mysteries from the wanna blessed bees, and innocent bystanders from the havoc wrought by inept use of magic. And sociologists were probably familiar with the concepts of the sacred and profane, and this is really at the heart of what Burrow was talking about with these oath-bound secrets. The mystery, the sacredness of the tradition, must be protected from the profane. Any contact between the mundane world and what is seen as the sacred mystical other contaminates the mystery. So mainstreaming profanes the sacred, and this happens through the greater accessibility to materials and tools and information. Sacred objects for sale, secrets that are commodified and readily available and revealed to anyone who walks into a mall. And the greater visibility in media and fashion, again, kind of relegates the sacred to mere spectacle or aesthetic, something superficial, certainly not sacred. Another thing to consider is Randall Collins's interaction ritual theory. So Collins is building off of Durkheim and Goffman to argue that feelings of group solidarity derive from energy that is built in community, in interaction with others, during rituals, and that symbols associated with the group will take on sacred status as vessels for this emotional energy that is built up. And furthermore, these symbols associated with the group become internalized as emotionally intense and meaningful. And this emotional basis is key for feelings of groupness, that visceral feeling of community and solidarity and identity. This has direct correlation to magical practice, so Burrow goes on to argue that to speak openly about the secret techniques of witchcraft is to literally dissipate their power. So there's a real sense in which the mainstreaming and opening up of these symbols to being commodified pollutes their original meaning and use within ritual contexts, and dilutes the emotional energy that is carried in that object in a way that makes it somehow less impactful. Especially if people are given the opportunity to encounter and purchase sacred objects and tools and buy books on the mysteries without the proper context, experience, or appreciation for them, and how to approach them, which is a training that one would receive if you were working directly with a teacher or a group or as part of an initiatory witchcraft tradition. So it can be a real problem that they're just kind of put out there without any context for anyone to come across. Like this, just walking into a Barnes & Noble there in the entryway in the bargain book section. Or you can see that very prominent aisle end display that's curated based on inspiration from #WitchTalk. Here's another example of a witchcraft display in a Spencer's Gifts in the same mall. Here they were selling a starter witch kit, which was actually categorized on their website as seasonal Halloween home decor. And this description doesn't lend itself to being taken seriously. Everything you need to conjure up some spells, you'll be the most wicked witch in all the land. So that could definitely be seen as disrespectful, or making light of what some people hold as a sincere and serious religious practice. Or how about in a Lowe's, right between your family handyman and your air fryer cookbook? Learn the forbidden secrets, the secrets which just happen to be available to anyone walking by a magazine rack in a hardware store. A great example of mainstreaming the mystery and profaning the sacred here. This was all over social media a couple of years ago when Sephora came out with a starter witch kit of their own, which consisted of some white sage, a piece of rose quartz, some perfumes, and a tarot deck that for some inexplicable reason had the symbol of Prince on it. And people pointed out that, this was a weird fad that would just flood people with the aesthetic, acting like it's, this cutesy, jokey thing. Not to mention the cultural appropriation and problematic sourcing of the white sage, which is sacred to many Native American traditions. And just the fact that like perfume doesn't necessarily have anything to do with witchcraft, so it was just kind of a nonsensical collection of items. So my participants showed a lot of concern over the quality of information that novices can receive, knowing that some of it might be incorrect or even harmful, but they were also concerned about possible consequences from information being so easy to access, as well as the sheer diversity of information out there as it relates to what I referred to earlier as this shared mental world. So in the 60s and 70s, becoming a pagan or a witch took some digging. Books were few and hard to find. Covens and other groups were pretty closed and private. It took effort to find those resources, find those groups, and prove yourself trustworthy of initiation and deserving of the secret knowledge. Whereas after the onset of the internet and this hypervisibility of the tradition, finding information can be absolutely effortless, or even unintentional if you just stumble across it in a mall. It's not that everyone is reading the same 5 books anymore. People start coming in through different channels, through an explosion of information on the internet, and any 13-year-old with an internet connection can set themselves up with a blog that a novice could potentially read and take as gospel. So people have called this watered down witchcraft. It's not the real thing. It's diluting the core of the tradition. It's the surface level skimming of the mysteries. It's nothing to build a practice around. And another problem that was brought up when it comes to easy access to materials is that it takes no dedication or effort. And relying on these tools could serve as a crutch, a shortcut, or a distraction, leading to lazy or less self-reliant witchcraft. Convenient, but standing in the way of actually doing the work of a witch and actually knowing your stuff. There's the assumption that people who had to demonstrate effort and really work for it are more authentic, more serious, and better witches than those for whom getting involved was easy. I want to share some comments from my participants now, and watch out for that ambivalence between protecting the tradition from those who might cheapen it by getting involved without having to demonstrate the proper commitment, and the more optimistic take on mainstream access. So Mary says, I'm sad whenever I think of how much easier it is to get into witchcraft today, although I might not be so sad because my wallet would have been hurting back in the day. I would have been so broke. But I think it's shaped how I practice. My first altar was literally a makeshift altar in a Tupperware box. Back then, you had to make do with what you had. You had to take stuff and repurpose it for witchy purposes, like getting a plain candle and dressing it and doing everything your own way. That's all we had. We didn't have these ready-made, dressed in intention, ready to go. You light it and walk away. We didn't have that. And they charge a fortune for it. And I'm like, shit, I'll just do it myself. But I think that's where you start when you're given the bare bones stuff and going, this is what you've got, make do with it. Ashley says, because everything's become so popular, the new age shops are definitely looking to take advantage of every confused ding-dong who walks in the store with a handful of cash trying to pay too much for the latest TikTok trend. I used to enjoy a certain witchy store years ago, but over the past 4 or 5 years, it's transformed into a more of a weird, overpriced cult. The items in even a few classes used to be decent. They felt authentic. It's a whole different beast now. Derek says, I feel there's definitely the outside assumption that you have to have the right stuff, the right clothes, the right crystals, or things that can feed into a little bit of the newcomer going, I have to buy all the right things. Whereas I know some people who are really accomplished and have nothing. They just do it by the seat of their pants. And I'm like, wow, that's awesome. You rock at this. Oliver says, everything that these starter witch kits are offering, like your tools, they're not what defines a witch. A witch is able to do magic without any of those. At the end of the day, they are just props. You're the one doing all the work. You're the one doing the spiritual practice. Chloe says, when I was a teenager, I would have just loved to get my hands on a pentacle. I wouldn't care, where I got it. I even made my own pentacle. I was desperate. So to me, my reaction is, oh, cool, it's getting more mainstream. Maybe we'll be more accepted. Maybe people will feel more comfortable asking me questions instead of just running the opposite way. But at the same time, I don't really like the association with Spencer's. And I don't want to make it sound like it cheapens it too, because I feel like such things, it takes away from what's really the real magic of being intuitive and really forming this path as a witch. It's not just a fad. I have mixed feelings on it because I think someone who's really genuine, like, I think that could be really helpful for them. But on the other hand, someone who just looks at it as a fad or a phase in their life, I think it'll be very unhelpful for them. And it makes it end up being like a joke to other people. Linda says, you can buy kits now or buy things at Sephora and places like that, which I have a tendency to look down my nose at. But at the same time, if that's what speaks to someone and leads them to their path, then get out of their way and let them have their fun, because if people find a lot of power in the trappings, that can lead to something much deeper. So I think it's much easier to get an initial open door into witchcraft, and you can find your way from there. Derek says that it's stupid that people complain about it, being everything so commercialized, because he says, I kind of like now that I can go get some cool gear and stuff instead of having to make my own or not having it available. Mary again is talking about how it's a cool thing to be a witch, and I'm going, oh shit, I was talking to my cousin one day about it, and I'm like, do you remember how hard it used to be just to get a freaking deck of tarot cards? You had to practically send away for that shit and do a smoke signal. It was a whole big thing. Now you can go to Barnes & Noble and have your pick. It's insanity. I love it, but it's insanity. And then Riley says, I think all the things we do in ritual, in witchcraft, me wearing a pentacle, wearing a gem, are to change our consciousness, to shift us into a new way of thinking that is out of the mundane. That's why we cast a circle, to create space out of time and space. And I think some of these implements do that. If it helps us shake loose of the stressful feeling of the day, this might be something that could intrigue somebody. And it's weird, it's distinct, it can kick somebody into a new way of thinking, and we all need that. So you can hear some of the ambivalence here. Some participants suggesting that big box stores carrying witchcraft supplies is unfortunate because of the kind of people that would attract, or the implication of who would be marketed to. Many people admitted they were a little judgmental of what they found as cringy or embarrassing, but without fail, every person who admitted that they found the Spencer's Witch Kit distasteful made a point of pointing out that it would also be useful as an entry point. There seems to be an implicit understanding that kits like this are fine for beginners, but serious witches are expected to find their way from there into a deeper practice. This work that many of the participants did to to distance themselves from these commodified goods while not outright rejecting them, was interesting. It seems as though there's simultaneously a hesitancy to gatekeep on behalf of the community by limiting access to neophytes and outsiders, while also maintaining distance from things associated with newcomers to the craft themselves. This distancing technique is a strategy many of my participants engaged in as a way to establish that they are serious practitioners, as opposed to dabblers, quote unquote, baby witches, or the merely curious. There are also various takes on these so-called props or tools or trappings, not merely as a means of support and assistance, but functioning as a crutch in a pejorative sense. On the one hand, this might be implying that to use these quote unquote props is to play at being a witch, a performance rather than authentic identity. But on the other hand, if we follow Goffman's example and things in terms of the dramaturgical metaphor, it's worth noting that the function of props in theatrical productions is to help set the scene, to make it easier for the audience and the actor to suspend disbelief and embody the role that they're playing. And this is kind of what Riley is getting at here, that there is, power in the trappings, that there is power in these props essentially to help get us into a ritual mindset. Very briefly, since I have to sum up, I want to highlight some implications of witchcraft as an aesthetic trend. Aesthetic signals are often used to convey group membership. All of my participants mentioned witchcraft-specific sartorial codes that can help people who also know the code identify each other, usually through the use of jewelry featuring witchy symbols or items. Meaning is imbued in codes and symbols that must be performed and displayed, but reception depends on the audience's ability to read and interpret the message correctly. So the market transformation and appropriation of witchy symbols and codes has rendered these symbols of identity and membership in the witchy community precarious. Identification based on these markers is no longer predictable or foolproof. So witches have to navigate not only the meanings they personally attach to particular elements, they also have to consider how items might be read by others in public contexts, with the awareness that these semiotic codes have taken on competing cultural meanings that have to be parsed based on other context clues. So several participants mentioned having to be very cautious in their interpretation of these codes and symbols that may or may not identify someone as a witch. So necklaces, jewelry are mentioned a lot. So Chloe says, if I wear my pentacle out, I'll get either, oh, I like your necklace, and to witches that means, hey, I'm a witch too. That, or you get frantic looks, like a stare down. Rhiannon talks about this code as well. So I get a kick out of meetings in the wild, meeting another witch in the wild, because we're very careful, very circumspect. So we'll be like, nice jewelry. I like your jewelry. I like your tattoos. I like your earrings, stuff like that. But every once in a while we'll get a wild blessed bee. And that's when you know that you've really found another witch in the wild, because now they know the password. Linda also talks about, the tip-off being jewelry, like a pentacle or a certain combination of stones. But misunderstandings can and do happen. So this is a true story that happened to me. I know, witches often wear celestial and nature-inspired jewelry, suns, moons, stars, trees, and that the pentagram or pentacle was also an important symbol for witches. So when I saw someone wearing this necklace on the left, I started up a conversation that quickly became clear was bewildering to her. Turns out this specific stylization of the star in the sun is a symbol on the TV show Supernatural, and she was wearing it as a mark of her fandom, not to identify herself as a witch. So this is a great example of how this mainstreaming of once mystery-bound in the know codes and symbols has the effect of diluting group solidarity by making it more challenging for members to recognize each other, and by reducing sacred symbols in some cases as decorative or fashion. As such, new codes or secondary and tertiary codes are being developed in this landscape where people know that some symbols may be appropriated and rendered empty by people wearing them without knowing their previous meanings or contexts. So Linda talking about the specific combination of stones that people are wearing, is there a logic to it? Bridget was also talking about the word practice. So she was talking to someone who she thought might be a witch, and she said, yeah, nobody out here really practices. So that word was a hint that maybe it's, this is more than just someone wearing crystals or a witchy aesthetic. And she talks about, it's funny how we have to code switch to see, are you one of us, or am I going to come out then you're going to perceive me as this kind of crazy lady or really into dark evil stuff? We could totally miss each other. So to summarize, there are pros and cons to each of the positions pagans may adopt in this saturated cultural landscape. On the one hand, the mainstream is welcoming to newcomers. It promotes ease of access to information and materials and tools. It's better positioned to take advantage of opportunities to generate emotional energy due to influx of members and fresh enthusiasm coming into the community. But it's more exposed and vulnerable to situations that drain or dilute the emotional energy available. The mystery camp, on the other hand, has more barriers to entry. There's some more gatekeeping and vetting involved, but it's more protective of information. So it advocates for a greater investment of time and energy of study and demonstrated commitment prior to accessing certain materials and tools. And although it generates less new emotional energy, it's better positioned to protect what is there. So emotions are often more intense. There's more community solidarity and thus greater and more close-knit energy than in the mainstreamers. To return to Kevin Whitener Jr., he says, this capitalist usurpation feels insurmountable as it encourages a community to make themselves or their needs known and advocate on behalf of their own visibility. To withhold this, though, is to subjugate one's selfhood, affinity, or needs, instead of running the risk of allowing stigma and visibility to inform one's identity. Thus, the greatest double bind to witchcraft is that obscurity and exploitation are equal threats. I would like to leave you with this thought from John Halstead, which I think sums up this tension incredibly well. So he writes, I will inevitably be accused of practicing respectability politics for this. Respectability politics refers to attempts by marginalized groups to police their own members and show their social values as being continuous and compatible with mainstream values, rather than challenging the mainstream for what they see as its failure to accept difference. I agree that we should not do that. We should not sacrifice authenticity for acceptance by the mainstream. On the other hand, I think concern for authenticity needs to be balanced with concern for effectiveness. Pagan spirituality has the potential to transform the world, but we can only do that to the extent that we are able to communicate with the world. Paganism is and should always be a challenge to the mainstream, but if we don't take ourselves seriously, then neither would anyone else. I'm not suggesting that we start acting and dressing mainstream, but I am suggesting that we need to dress and act like we have something serious and important to say to the rest of the world, because we do. Paganism is more than a fashion statement. Rebellion for rebellion's sake is not virtuous, it's adolescent. What's more, it isolates us. And isolation does not serve us or the world. Our power to effect change, our magic, is inversely proportional to our insularity. Respectability has become something of a dirty word among pagans, but there's a difference between respectability and respect. Respect means power, power to bring about change according to our collective will, and that is a kind of magic that all pagans should be interested in. Thank you.